Story 1. My friend invited me to a sleepover at his house. We weren't allowed to wake up before his parents. When I was 11, I was at the very bottom of my class until the teacher, Ms. Henry, made me sit next to the new kid. Thomas and his family moved into town halfway through term, so he just sort of appeared one day. During his second week, Ms. Henry tried to draw him out of his shell by asking about his favorite TV program. "What's a TV program?" he replied. That got a laugh. Clearly, he was playing dumb to put one over on her. Everybody thought he'd emerge as the next class clown, but instead he rarely spoke and aced every subject. A few girls tried befriending him. They dug that children of the corn look, I guess, but agreed he was a weirdo after chatting with him in the lunch hall. As desk buddies, he and I locked horns. A lot. Because I was left-handed, our elbows bumped together whenever we wrote, and he got super pissed any time I asked to borrow a pencil, so I of course did this as often as possible. Any time I asked Miss Henry to split us up, she'd just sneer and say, "Ryan, there's going to be times in life when you're forced to spend time with people you don't like. Get used to it." One day, as I struggled with a difficult maths exam, Thomas offered to help. I'm guessing he finished early and got bored. It was my first day. Without either of us ever agreeing to it, he started helping me with homework and tough assignments, and soon my grades improved so much my mom bought me a bunch of Pokemon cards as reward. I offered Thomas some of the one I already owned, but he didn't even know what a Pokemon's was. Then one day, out of the blue, he asked if I'd sleep over at his place. "Father really wants to meet you," he said. Why did his parents even know who I was? We sat together, sure, but he knew so little about pop culture, getting through a conversation was like chewing colt. Still, I wanted to thank him for his help, and my mom didn't raise any objections, so that Friday I packed some clothes and cycled over to his place. I drove down several short roads flanked by woods, past a train station, toward the outskirts of town. Thomas's two-story house sat at the top of a long driveway so steep that I needed to jump off my bike and push most of the way, and all the windows were either boarded up or had the curtains pulled shut. Things got spooky the second I arrived. Thomas and his parents waited patiently to greet me, each grinning like they were on a poster for tooth whitening. Everybody had matching blonde hair and dressed in plain shades of brown, gray, and white. A large man introduced them as the Donovans. My preteen brain categorized him and his wife as old, but in retrospect there must have been a 20-year age difference there. Mr. Donovan walked my bike into the garage, while me and Thomas followed his mom inside. Something was wrong with the house. It looked too sterile. No clutter, zero toys scattered about. Plus, the antique furniture was older than my grandparents'. In every room, sheets had been draped over objects mounted along the paneled walls, and Mrs. Donovan made a point of telling me that touching the sheets is strictly forbidden. She led us into a sitting room decorated with crucifixes, and more crucifixes, of varying sizes. We kneeled down on a colorful rug, facing each other. The only sound was the ticking of a grandfather clock. At last Mr. Donovan joined our group and led a prayer for the standard stuff. Good health, blessed weather. Even though I'd gone to Protestant church with my grandparents, I couldn't figure out what religion we were meant to be practicing. He obviously thought of himself as a spiritual leader, and devoted a lot of time to the blind sinners who would suffer swift retribution on Judgment Day. It wasn't until he called for a minute of holy silence that I heard a low, shaken voice. I concentrated hard, tuning out the clock. There were muffled cries from somewhere within the room. I peeked my left eye open. Nobody was watching, although the way the family didn't stop grinning made me shiver. I glanced around the room. We were alone. When I turned back towards the circle, Thomas's mom was staring straight at me, her smile practically splitting the seams of her face. Quickly I shut my eyes, already anxious to go home. The silence seemed to last forever. Finally, the spiritual leader clapped his hands and said we should go out back and toss a ball around. On my way out of the room, I listened for more cries, but the sound had died off. I figured my imagination got the better of me. As Thomas and I tossed a leather ball back and forth in the long grass, his dad watched from a crude decking area, beaming. Like at school, Thomas threw with his right hand, whereas I favored my left. We kept trying to pass each other bad shots, competing to make the other miss a catch. It was all in good fun, though. Thomas acted even weirder than at school. Away from his parents, he at least seemed interested in subjects like TV. But now he strictly spoke about Bible stories and recited his favorite verses. I sidestepped his questions, my spirituality, as much as I could. My arm was aching by the time Mrs. Donovan called us for dinner. In the kitchen, we gathered around the table, and then she brought in a metal pan, presenting 5 boneless chicken breasts lathered in lumpy gravy and canned peaches. Before we ate, everybody linked arms for another prayer, and part of me wished the ritual would never end, because then we'd need to choke down the food. A heavy silence fell over the room. Then those cries started up again, closer than before. It sounded like a child, and their voice had a panicky quality. If it wasn't for the threat of another glare from Thomas's mom, I would have peeked. As the prayer dragged on, the crying became more hysterical, until finally something rattled against the wall behind me. Mr. Donovan's voice raised, thunderous now, and drowned out the sound. I'm not sure which scared me more, but either way my arms broke out in goosebumps. The sermon ended 5 minutes later, and we sat there in silence until the head of the table said, "Amen." I checked the corners for sobbing children, finding only more sheets. What then? A CD player? My imagination? The uncooked chicken made me gag. I didn't want to cause trouble, so I picked around the moldy peaches and spread out the plate so it looked like I'd eaten more than I actually had. There was chocolate cake for dessert, but Thomas's mom went around slicing a piece onto each of our plates, which was still covered with chicken and gravy. By that point my stomach was growling, so I scoffed down a top layer of cake which hadn't touched anything else. I wanted to leave. Faking a belly ache, I asked if they would call my mom and have her come pick me up. Thomas's dad raised an eyebrow. "No need. We have a special remedy." He told the rest of the family to pray for my health and led me out of the room. The front door was on my left, and I briefly considered making a run for it, but the second I did, Mr. Donovan's hand clamped around my shoulder tight. His smile never wavered, but something about his eyes made me break out in goosebumps, like an implied threat. So I let him guide me into a vintage bathroom. There was a covered cabinet above the sink, and the tub was already full. A thick layer of scud, plus a few dead flies, floated along the surface. Mr. Donovan poured something into the murky water, salt maybe, and ordered me to strip off my t-shirt so I could dip my midsection in. I told him I'd made a miraculous recovery. "Ah, the power of prayer," he said, grinning so wide I could count the back teeth. After that he announced it was time for bed, despite the fact it wasn't even dark yet. Upstairs, at the very far end of the hall, a huge object spanning the width of both walls was covered by another sheet. We got ushered me into Thomas's room, which was even more dull and lifeless than the rest of the house. A queen-sized bed, one small cupboard, and a single wooden chair tucked in the corner. We needed to share the bed, but only after another round of prayer. Then it was lights out before 9 o'clock. Alone with my friend, I rolled over and asked what religion his family practiced anyway. He gave the vaguest answers possible, and when I pushed him, became hyper-defensive. "So," I said, "hey, do you ever want to punch Ms. Henry right in her stupid ugly face?" That made him laugh. Away from his parents, he became more like his school self. Not normal, but closer than before. We argued over who the hottest girl in class was, followed by the most annoying. Without meaning to, I brought up one who always teased him, and it was like all the energy leaked out of my new friend. "I know everybody thinks I'm odd," he sighed. "They just need to get to know you like I did. They'll come around." "You think so?" "Absolutely." He smiled. Then, after a little while, he said, "Hey, wanna see something creepy? I'll show you if you think you're brave enough not to wet the bed." I rolled my eyes. He wanted to rattle me, like when we played ball. "Sure. We've got to wait until Mother and Father retire for the night." I kept asking what he had planned, but he wouldn't answer. He got a kick out of keeping me in the dark, I think. He waited until the house fell quiet, and then swung his legs out of bed. "This way." In the chilly, dark hall, enough moonlight shone through the windows beside the staircase to see by. As we tiptoed past several closed doors, that crying returned, growing louder as we approached the object beneath the black sheet. "Not my imagination, then." Facing me, Thomas whispered, "Don't worry if he looks at you. Just make sure you look away fast. You'll be fine so long as you look away fast." Before I could ask what that meant, he crouched down, grabbed the corner of the sheet, and pulled it back, revealing an antique armoire. Suddenly, the crying became less muffled. A mirrored panel ran along the bottom section, surrounded by fine, gargoyle-like carvings. Still holding the blanket, Thomas pushed his left ear against the carpet and stared at the glass. "He's there. Come look quick. I just wanted to get this over with." I lay down. For a second I stared at the reflected hall, confused about why we were even there. But then an out-of-place shape caught my eye. I told myself it was my reflection, but then realized I had no reflection. A boy was standing in the corner with his back to us. His shoulders went up and down like he couldn't stop sobbing. "Do you see him?" Thomas asked. I swallowed a gulp, my blood running cold. "Neato, huh?" My brain scrambled for an explanation. It was a trick, or a nasty prank. I looked behind me. Nothing, only a bare patch of wall. "He's not there," Thomas said. "Only in the mirror." When I looked back, the boy was much closer and crouched on his side, nose to nose with me. His features were all stretched out, long and narrow like a funhouse mirror, and he had a shock of blonde hair to go with them. His thin lips twisted into a grotesque smile as the boy reached out to me, the tips of his fingers pushing through the glass into reality. I couldn't move a muscle until his face was only inches away from mine, his breath blasting me in the face like a gust of cold air. I scrambled away. If my throat hadn't hitched itself shut, I would have screamed. Quickly Thomas dropped the sheet and dragged me up by the shoulder, then shoved me down the hall. Behind us the armoire thrashed from side to side, its hinges squeaking, the boy crying again. Now his voice had an almost hysterical quality. Back in the safety of his room, Thomas pressed his ear against the door until the armoire quietened down. "We are blessed Father didn't hear," he said. "Now we sleep. Father said we aren't to rise before he wakes us to begin the morning ritual." He must not have been the least bit scared by what we saw, because he ushered me into bed and dozed off straight away. But my body wouldn't quit trembling. What was that thing in the mirror? Were there more of them? Is that why they hung sheets everywhere? But why keep any mirrors at all? One thing was for sure. I couldn't spend the night in that house. But Thomas's dad would never let me go. I needed to get the hell out of there without being seen. After Thomas's breathing eased into a rhythm, I swung my legs onto the floor and tiptoed out of the room, toward the stairs, but as I approached the top, footsteps came clomping along. I ducked behind the nearest door. Through the narrow gap, I watched Mr. Donovan march past with a rectangular object tucked beneath his arm. There was a tinkling sound from beneath the sheet. He carried it over to Thomas's room, grunting the whole way, and disappeared through the door. My stomach lurched into my throat. I didn't want to find out what he had planned. I flew down the stairs, carefully, quietly. I kept my hand against the wall for guidance. The front door was locked. My bike still was in the garage, I hoped. But how did I get there from the landing? Above my head, there were angry shouts of, "He's gone! No time for plans!" I sprinted around the ground floor, flying from room to room. Cries rang out in every one, and now the objects beneath the sheets danced on the walls, bouncing around. The crying child sounded terrified now, like they were in pain. Past the kitchen, there was a cramped utility room with another door. The temperature plummeted as I bolted through it, into the garage. The light switch was on the inside wall. I flicked it. Then a naked bulb blinked on. Junk was scattered everywhere. Car parts, step ladders, boxes of old newspapers, and more sheets thrown over different mirrors, each flapping and twisting. There were more cries, except not just the boy, and for a second I was afraid to move. But then a door slammed shut behind me, and I ran for it. My bike was propped up against the wall beside the exit, its handlebar stubbornly tangled with a Christmas tree. After a few tugs, it came loose, and it was like setting off a Rube Goldberg machine. A mop and bucket fell into a stepladder, which clattered to the floor and sent a bag of marbles sprawling across the floor, and so on. I grabbed the bike's handlebars. The exit was one of those old, fold-up doors you needed to twist the handle to open. My hands were shaking so badly I needed to set the bike aside and focus solely on this task. The door rotated up. Behind me, Thomas's dad burst into the room, and for the first time he'd stopped smiling. He rushed after me, but struggled to get through the minefield of junk. My bike's rear wheel became tangled with a sheet, and when I started running it came away like a magician ripping away a tablecloth. I heard the mirror fall to the floor and shatter. Laughter rang out, and when I glanced back over my shoulder, bone-thin arms were reaching out of the glass towards Mr. Donovan. As the garage light rapidly flicked on and off, Mr. Donovan screamed. I will never, as long as I live, forget the terror in that scream. Pure adrenaline got me out of there. Without slowing down, I sprinted to the top of the driveway and leapt onto the bike and flew down the hill. Behind me, screams rang out from deeper in the house. I didn't stop to look back. Mom wasn't pleased about me cycling home so late, but I made up an excuse about Thomas's family getting sick and needing to leave in a hurry, so she let it slide. I knew she'd never believe my story. I tried faking an illness to get out of school because I was so anxious about seeing Thomas again, but she was having none of it. I spent all of Saturday and Sunday wondering about what I'd seen. On Monday, my desk buddy sat without breathing a single word. We never spoke again, and we didn't bump elbows once. To my great relief, Miss Henry announced Thomas's family had moved again the very next day. I never saw him after that, although for a while I had nightmares about his dad dragging me back inside their house, and they tend to flare up any time I see a mirror-fronted armoire. Story 2. The employees at the zoo are not human. Around 5 years ago, I took my girlfriend Abby to the zoo. Now, don't get me wrong. I don't dislike the zoo. I also don't love it. It always just felt a little weird to me, watching all those animals in cages. It doesn't necessarily bother me enough not to go, however. I would never go on my own volition. I remember that week we both got a Thursday off from work. We decided it would be fun to go do something that would normally be busy on the weekend. As we pulled into the zoo parking lot, it seemed we had a good plan. It was at least half as busy as usual, even though it was 9 a.m. and they just opened. As we got out of the car, my girlfriend and I put on some sunscreen and made sure our snacks made it into our backpacks. My girlfriend let out an excited squeal as she saw the sign for the zoo entrance. It made me smile. I wasn't there to watch the animals after all. I was there because I knew it would make her happy. I just wanted to see her reactions to her favorite animals. I wish I knew back then what was in store for her. I wish she didn't have to see the horrors of the zoo that day. If you are reading this, Abby, I'm so sorry. I hope you can forgive me one day. We walked up to the gate. Abby held my hand and resisted the urge to skip. We made our way to the line to get tickets and chatted about what animals to go see first while we waited. Next! A voice from the farthest booth called out in a cheery tone. As we walked up to the ticket booth, I wasn't fully paying attention. Typically, I like to give people who are working jobs like this my full attention and try to be as nice as possible. Make eye contact, be patient, not be on my phone. You know, the common courtesy you should pay to an employee like this. I try my best to make up for the annoying Karens who ruin their days by doing these things. However, I was fumbling with my wallet, and Abby was behind me asking me something, so I was awkwardly facing her as I walked up. As I was looking at my wallet for a credit card that I misplaced, I looked up at the employee to apologize for taking so long. After glancing at him for a second, I had to do a double take. Not on purpose or anything. My brain just did it automatically. No problem, sir. Take your time, the odd man in the ticket booth said as Abby slipped her card over to him. Wonderful. Let's get you 2 tickets so the fun can begin. As he ran the card, I felt like my eyes were glued on his face. My brain was trying to make sense of what exactly was off about him. Of course, most of all was the tone of his voice. It sounded way too happy, almost robotic, or like it was from a kid's cartoon. His mouth was just slightly too wide. The teeth inside his mouth were too white and perfect. His eyes looked like marbles moving around in his head. I think I only saw him blink once. I know that because the blink was painfully slow. I thought he was making a joke or something. His neck seemed to be just barely too long, and the last thing I noticed was his joints didn't seem to be a normal proportion. For example, his forearms were shorter than what felt normal. Oh, silly me. I almost forgot to mention something important. I cringed as the man kept talking. The park is no longer taking credit cards beyond this point, and you are required to click on the link in your email to link your card to our brand new Zoo Wallet feature. Much more convenient than taking out a card every 5 minutes to buy something. I tried to tell him we were not inserted and we had cash, but he went on and on about how it was a new policy. I thought it seemed a little off and like some kind of scam, but Abby looked anxious, so I agreed and did what he wanted. I definitely should have seen it as a red flag when the guy made us both do the whole process, but I didn't want to disappoint Abby. The argument wasn't worth getting kicked out. Alrighty, you crazy kids. You are all set. Don't forget to see the seal show at 12:15 at the main pool, the employee said with a smile that seemed to stretch his mouth even wider apart. Oh, okay. Thank you, I said in a rush, realizing I was probably staring at the man like he was a monster the whole time. We walked into the entrance and were greeted with a gift shop, a map of the park, a snack shack, and some benches. I was going to ignore how creeped out I felt and try to focus on my girlfriend. I followed her to whatever exhibit she wanted to see first. She was quiet, so I pulled her into the shade and asked her what was wrong. As I asked her, she looked around like she was paranoid. Sorry, Noah, it's probably nothing. It's just that I got creeped out by that guy. And normally when someone creeps me out, I don't think about it for much longer, but dash. I thought she was going to say more, but she stopped there. I sighed. I wasn't sure if it was good or bad that she got the same feeling from the guy. You know what? I got the same feeling from him, but let's not let it ruin our date. We should keep an eye out for him, but other than that, let's just relax and have fun. You're right, you're right. Okay, first on our list are the penguins. she said as she happily grabbed my hand and pulled me in the direction of the penguin exhibit. We made it to the penguins, and she was devastated to not see any. She moved on quickly, trying to not waste any time, and headed towards the elephants. As we walked up to the elephants, we noticed they were gone too. I didn't think much of it because I felt like it's normal to not have some animals out. She didn't think it was normal. We saw an ice cream stand, so we went up to buy some and thought we'd ask the worker if he knew what animals would be out today. As we got closer, I heard a small gasp from Abby. She grabbed my arm and pulled me away from the ice cream stand. Am I crazy? Did you get a good look at the guy selling the ice cream? Abby said to me in a worried tone. I felt a shiver down my spine. No, why? I said, trying to not sound scared. That guy looks the same as the guy who gave us our tickets. Not exactly, but the mouth, the eyes, the arms. It's the same. What the hell? Abby, they are probably related. Calm down. I promise it's okay. If he creeps you out, we don't need to get ice cream. Let's just keep walking around. She nodded and gave a half-convinced smile. The first animals we found were the monkeys and apes. However, some of the exhibits were empty. They had chimps, orangutans, and baboons, but the capuchin and the gorillas didn't seem to be out. We stood in front of the glass, watching the animals with a couple of other people. After watching them for a few minutes, we shared a glance. A confused glance. Noah, are they sick? They aren't acting right. No, babe, they aren't sick. I'm sure it's just nap time or something. I said to try and calm her, but I knew nothing about these animals, or how they normally act in a zoo. I didn't know what to say to make her not worry about them. She told me she was going to find a bathroom, but she'd be right back. I felt concerned as she walked off, but I tried to take the opportunity to look closer at the animals without it freaking Abby out. I got close to the glass of the orangutans. I have always felt a bit of unease about monkeys and apes. They just feel so human that I feel weird looking at them in this setting, but this felt so much worse. One of them looked me in the eye, and it felt so human it made my stomach turn. I saw it weakly grab at its side and wince in pain. I saw a line of stitches on its side. They looked sore. I felt terrible. I hated that I was even supporting this place. Abby came back a few minutes later, and we left before she could see the orangutan in pain. Next, we headed for the tigers. We walked up to the outdoor tiger enclosure and saw a few tigers lying out in the sun. This time it wasn't hard to tell something was really off. I saw moms pulling their kids away and people looking in shock, not able to look away. Some people laughed thinking it was a joke. We should have just left then. We had so many signs of something being wrong. I don't know why we didn't listen. We walked up to view the tigers and saw something that took our brains far too long to process. What we first saw as tigers, we noticed that the only thing tiger-like about them was the stripes. After looking for a while, we realized what we were looking at. People. People lying out in the hot sun painted like tigers, except they had ears on top of their heads. Their torsos looked longer than normal, and their arms and legs were now shorter. It was clear they were human, but horribly modified to look like something else. People started to scream and ran to the exit. Abby and I did the same. We got out our phones to call 911, but soon found our phones were completely fried, not even turning on. As I looked around at the rest of the crowd, I saw other people in the same situation. That damn link they made us click for our credit cards must have been one hell of a virus to kill all our phones like that. Abby said to me with tired lungs. I felt so dumb at that moment. I swear that's the oldest trick in the book. Now we were all unable to call for help. As we made it to the gate, an employee shut all the exits. Abby grabbed my arm with what felt like all her strength. The employee looked just like the other creepy employees we had seen. A different hair color and height, but nonetheless, just as creepy and uncanny as the other guys. He turned around to greet us. "Hello, everyone. What seems to be the matter? Aren't we all having fun? You have to at least stay for the seal show at 12:15. The crowd of around 50 people started revolting and yelling at the man, demanding they be let out. The man's smile slowly morphed into a frown as he grabbed a man standing near him. As the man screamed to let him go, one more employee walked up to the flailing man. One employee grabbed his shoulders and the other grabbed his waist. The man started wailing in pain as the two employees started to stretch his torso to be longer. Next, they grabbed his arms and legs and pushed on them to make them shorter. The man stopped fighting and went limp. After they were done, they threw him on the ground. The shape of his body now matched the tiger's we just saw. He was just missing the stripes, tall, and ears. The crowd was silent. Now, unless anyone else wants to go into the tiger exhibit, I highly suggest everyone makes their way to watch our seal show, the employee said as his terrifying smile grew back on his face. Right this way, folks, he said with a pep in his step as he skipped to the seals. We all followed in horror. I felt so helpless. I was supposed to keep my girlfriend safe. She was quiet, but I could hear her shaking breath and feel her clammy hands holding mine. As we walked to the seals, we passed by a few other enclosures on the way. I wish I could have somehow blocked Abby from seeing what I saw, but the damage was already done. We passed by the bears and saw more people lying in the hot sun. Awkward patches of fur covered them. Their bodies morphed into unnatural states. Then we walked by some deer. Most of the people lying on the ground, but some trying to stand on their brand new 4 legs, but falling and screaming in pain. I could see blood on their heads from where the antlers were put in. After what felt like miles, we made it to the seal show. About 10 employees surrounded us, all of them with the same terrorizing futures. The setup for the show wasn't anything too crazy. Just a few bleachers lined up facing an in-ground pool and a platform where an employee stood with a microphone to talk about the show. I don't think I've ever heard such a glaring, painful silence in my life. I think we were expecting to be sacrificed or something. The anticipation was awful. One of the employees walked up to the platform by the pool, his footsteps loud and echoing in the process. How are we all doing? Having a whole lot of fun, I hope. He hated our silence. He then said it again into the mic, this time much louder and in a much deeper, angry tone. I said, "How are we all doing?" We all nervously clapped, trying to avoid getting turned into an animal. Glad to hear everyone is having such a magical day. Don't forget that we will be closing right after the seal show, so everyone please make sure you head out right after the show. But remember, kiddos, leaving in the middle of a show is rude. The show began. We heard music from the speakers and saw a second employee come out dragging something. I think the employee who had the mic was spouting out some random facts about seals or something, but that's not where my mind was focusing. I was focused on the employee dragging a person to the pool. The person had their arms duct taped to their sides. Their legs were taped together, and a cheap-looking fin was taped on their feet while also painted grey. It looked like the employees had not morphed them yet. They tried to scream but had duct tape covering their mouths as well. It seemed like once they got morphed their minds went to mush. This poor person seemed to be still fully conscious while being tied up and dragged to the water while 50 people watched. Just as the employee was saying something about seals being great swimmers, the person was thrown into the water. We all sat and watched as the person with their entire body bound by duct tape sank to the bottom of the pool. People started to panic again and try to fight back or escape. Abby and I sat in fear as we saw the employees catch helpless people and turn them into something unrecognizable. Abby and I sat in disbelief as we watched not only so many people around us become something else, but at least 20 people or seals were thrown into the pool. Helpless. 30 minutes later, the show was over. Only around 15 people remained on the bleachers as the employees took a bow. Thank you everyone for coming. Don't forget we are now closed. Our staff will now escort you out of the park. The employees started walking towards the exit. Abby seemed relieved, trying to not get too excited, but started to cry and just wanted to get out of that place. I knew I had something I needed to do that would make Abby angry, something that might cost me my life, but the employees seemed to not be watching us as closely. I knew I had to act right that second. "I'm so sorry, but I have to do this," I said as I gripped her shoulder and whispered softly. Her head swung to look at me. Her eyes were wide as saucers and her muscles tensing up. As we followed the group of employees walking us to the exit, we went around a bend with some bushes. I snuck into one of them hoping and praying the employees wouldn't see me. They made it very clear that the zoo was closed and they wanted us to leave. I figured I knew what my fate would be if I got caught. I sat in the bush watching as they escorted Abby and the rest of the others out. I was trying so hard to stay still that I needed to remind myself to breathe. I only had to wait for about 15 seconds before they were all out of eye line. The way the employees skipped as they walked seemed to help them move fast. I soon felt the confidence to get up and go search the zoo for anyone I could save. I know it might seem dumb to even try and save anyone, but it seemed like the seals were still pretty aware of everything going on. I thought I could maybe find more people that were not damaged so terribly that I could save them. I started into a sprint. I didn't think the employees would come around or anything, but I couldn't be sure. And if people were suffering somewhere in the zoo, I wanted to help them as soon as possible. I was running from exhibit to exhibit, first seeing if the animals were gone entirely, or if they had people in them. Then I would try and decide if they were too far gone to even help. I felt an enormous weight on my shoulders. Who am I to decide if someone should be saved or not? I realized after looking at the exhibits how to figure out if I'd find people in them. If the animal was dramatically bigger or smaller than a person, the animals would be missing from that exhibit entirely. Only the animals that were similar in size to humans were replaced by a person. What I gathered from that information is that the employees' morphing abilities were limited. When people got morphed into an animal, they didn't have to be an exact size match, but slightly lengthening/shortening limbs or torsos and making it hard for them to walk like humans, but that was about all they could do. They couldn't make ears or a tail grow out of someone. They couldn't get fins or fur, but they sure did their best to simulate it. However, some of the exhibits still had people in them despite not being the exact size of that animal. The bear exhibit, for example. It felt like the employees had an okay understanding of animal sizes, but not great. They knew a penguin was too small and an elephant was too big, but I'm not completely sure where the line was. I don't think they knew either. As I would look into the exhibits, I would call out to them. If anyone was still able to talk, I would try to get them out. I know that's not the deciding factor over if someone is worth saving, but I wasn't thinking clearly. I knew I couldn't help everyone, and I had to make some tough decisions. Most of the times I called out to them, nothing came out of their mouths. Some of them half-heartedly opened their mouths, but nothing came out, and they stopped. I ran up to the zebras and yelled in. To my amazement, someone called back in a quiet, helpless, "Help!" The enclosure was easy for me to get into. It was just a big fence, so I got in fast. I got to the person who called out to me and dropped to my knees. I couldn't believe how much worse it was up close. I was trying my best not to look at their deformed body, but it was like trying to look away from a car crash. I could see their once human body now sculpted into something unearthly. I could see where fake zebra ears were harshly sewn into the side of their head, their hands sewn together in a fist to try and simulate a huff. Their body was painted in cheap white paint, and black stripes were poorly brushed over it. A mane that looked like it was superglued to the back of their head and down the back of their neck, made out of a cheap party wig. Even after looking at all the terrible things that had been done to this person, I realized the part that made my stomach turn the most was the human face remained the same. Of course, the sickly body of the person made me feel nauseous, but the completely unchanged human face made me feel like I was going to lose it. For some reason, the employees put more effort into some of the morphing than others. Maybe they ran out of time and had to rush the last few. When we saw the monkeys first, they seemed to almost be sewn into fursuits, realistic enough to not have us running for the doors just yet. Still creepy as hell, nonetheless. I realized as I was sitting by this person, there was no way to get them out and help them. I felt so stupid. I should have known I couldn't get anyone out. One of my flaws has always been blind optimism. I thought I could find a way. I thought I'd have some kind of a brilliant plan once I saw someone who needed help, but I had nothing. I knew I just needed to try and get out safe and get the police. I felt regret. I should have just walked out with Abby and made sure she was safe. If I had followed the group out, I could have called the police by now. Why did I have a savior complex? As I sat in my self-pity and saw something underneath the person, I lightly pulled on it and a dirt-covered lanyard came out. It had a photo ID and a name on it. The face matched the person in front of me. Ken, I whispered to the creature that was once human. He looked up at me and smiled. It was a sad, tired smile, but I could tell he was happy to just hear his name again. It probably helped him feel more human again. Just as soon as his smile came, it was gone again and replaced by pain. His balled-up, bloody fist reached down to his side as he moaned in pain. I could tell something was very wrong, but I knew I couldn't do anything about it. I just sat with him for a few minutes and watched him take his final breath. I tried to not let the guilt overtake me as I sat with his dead body. After a few minutes, I gave up on trying to save anyone myself. I just needed to get out. Luckily, I was at the backside of the zoo and could see a brick wall I could jump. I made my way out pretty easily. Just a few cuts and bruises. Once I was out of the zoo, I didn't even bother going to the parking lot to get my car or find Abby. I knew I just had to get to a working phone. I made it to a gas station about 15 minutes later and used the phone to call 911. After that, I called my sister to come get me. I knew if my phone still wasn't working, then odds were Abby's phone wouldn't work. I still tried a couple of times as I waited for my sister to see if I got lucky. Once my sister got me, we went to Abby's house. Her mom opened the door and she looked pissed. She told me Abby didn't want to talk to me. I was sad she didn't want to talk, but I was greatly relieved that she made it out and was home safe. I told her mom I understood and went home. I kept checking the news, looking for anything about the zoo, but nothing. I waited until the next morning and still no news about it. I decided to drive back to the zoo at around 2 p.m. The zoo was normally open until 6 p.m. however. The day I was there the employees so graciously closed early. I had to go back, it was all I could think about. I had to know. As I came into the parking lot, I was amazed to find it busy. People coming and going, laughing, having a great time. I was so confused. I decided I needed a closer look, so I parked out and walked up to the ticket booth. I could feel my hands sweat as I got closer and closer to the entrance, but I had to know what was going on. From the back of the line I could see the employees, and they looked normal. I wanted to get closer and see inside, so I got in line to buy a ticket. I was warmly welcomed by the employee giving me my ticket. She was moving slowly, but she was friendly, and most importantly, not one of those sick creators from yesterday. She looked confused at her computer screen and asked a coworker for help. "Oh, I know what happened. You need to do this instead," the employee's coworker said as she randomly pushed buttons to make the computer work. "Ugh, I'm so sorry, sir. We got your ticket working now. Sorry for the wait. A bunch of previous employees quit yesterday or something, and they didn't want to close the zoo while they trained new people, so most everyone here today is brand new to the job. We appreciate your patience." I froze where I stood. I didn't know what to say or what to do. Those disgusting creators came in and morphed all the zoo employees into animals, and showed them off and terrorized so many zoo customers just for the owners of the zoo to reopen the next day. Do they even know what happened? Do you by any chance have any more information on what happened with the employees? I said to the woman as I was greeted with a confused eye squint. No, sorry, I don't. I just needed the money, so I took the job." No, that's fine, don't be sorry. I was just wondering if you knew," I said to the woman as she stood in her ticket booth awkwardly. I made my way into the park. I immediately noticed all the small and large animals were back and looked totally normal and healthy. I checked on all the enclosures that had people in them the day before very closely, and to my surprise, everything was normal. All the animals, big, medium, and small, back to normal. It was the same with the employees. All normal. I continued to do more research into the employees that got brutally turned into animals. I found nothing. It was all covered up. It looked like the zoo just said they all quit. Not sure how them just disappearing was explained to their families. I tried to go to the cops and give them my testimony, but unsurprisingly, it wasn't believable. Abby never wanted to tell the cops, or anyone for that matter, what happened that day. She told me in a letter a few months later that she could never forgive me for abandoning her at the zoo. She understood why I felt the need to help other people, but was hurt that I didn't feel the same need to protect her and keep her safe. I haven't heard from her since. Still to this day, I have no clue what those morphing creators were. It was like they even tried to morph themselves to look human and then put on some kind of weird show for us. Maybe trying to impress us, or maybe trying to scare us. I will never know. It seemed like they had no respect for human life, but still cared about the animals. I say this because they never used any real animal parts for their vile creations. It was always cheap replicas of animal parts. The new employees seemed clueless about anything weird happening. I ended up finding a couple of old employees that were still alive. The ones that had that dreadful day off of work. I was able to talk to one who was a janitor. He showed up at the zoo the next day with all the gates still locked and customers wanting to get in. It took a while before they found someone with a key to even get it. I asked him about how the animals looked that morning, and he was confused about me being worried about the animals, but didn't think much of it and told me they were fine. Just a little hungry. So those creatures took the animals somewhere else for safekeeping while they played their sick little game on us? I've tried so hard to put the pieces together, but I honestly just want to move on now. I'm telling this here as a sense of closure. I want to move on with my life, and I'm hoping this will do the trick.